Hello, and welcome to MDIC's Annual Public Forum. During today's session, we are joined by Stephanie Christopher, Senior Program Manager, Health Insights at Providence St. Joseph Health, and Carrie Kuehn, Senior Manager, Regulatory and Clinical at Evidation Health, for a discussion about patient preference and real-world evidence strategies to develop a patient-centered regulatory strategy. Please make sure to join in the conversation on Twitter by following @MDIC Annual Forum and using the hashtag MDICAPF 2020. Now, please welcome Stephanie Christopher and Carrie Kuehn.
Thanks for joining us today for this broadcast of the MDIC Annual Public Forum. Carrie and I are both delighted to be here as part of this year's Annual Public Forum, talking about two topics that we really enjoy talking about, and that is using patient preferences and real-world evidence data to create a comprehensive, patient-focused regulatory strategy. Our objectives today are as follows: to discuss trends and strategies for stewarding patient data through real-world evidence research, understand methodologies for effectively assessing patient preferences and integrating patient preferences into your medical device regulatory strategy, and to understand current CDRH guidance on patient preference information and use of real-world evidence for regulatory submissions. By means of introduction, I know some of you are looking on the names on today's session and saying, wait, I remember those ladies, but wait, they're not necessarily at MDIC anymore. Well, Carrie and I still are no longer actively at MDIC. We're still excited about the work that MDIC does, and we really wanted to support MDIC through participating in this annual public forum. For those of you who don't know, I was a longtime employee at MDIC and just left last summer. I led our patient preference initiative, our science of patient input initiative, and our case for quality projects. And I'm now at Providence St. Joseph Health. Carrie is an FDA regulatory consultant, which is how I first met her. She helped me with a couple of our key projects, and she also was a committee member on the Science of Patient Input Steering Committee and always answered her emails promptly, which is the best endorsement I can give of a committee member. She's the founder of Patient by Design and is now at Evidation Health. So why would we combine these two topics into a presentation? These seem like different topics, patient preference and real-world evidence. And indeed, you will hear about these topics separately, both during the MDIC Annual Public Forum series and at other conferences. But Carrie and I believe you can't really talk about one of these topics without addressing the other. Real-world evidence research without patient input is meaningless. Likewise, patient preference data without solid real-world evidence data backing is also meaningless. Every medical device manufacturer ultimately wants the same thing: to make products that will make a meaningful difference in the life and health of their patients. A patient-centered regulatory strategy, considering both real-world evidence and patient preferences, will help accomplish exactly that. So let's get started in the real world. First, let's start with some definitions. These come from the FDA guidance on real-world evidence use in medical devices. Real-world data are the data relating to patient health status and/or the delivery of healthcare, routinely collected from a variety of sources. Real-world data can come from sources including electronic health records, claims and billing activities, product and device registries, patient-generated data, including data generated in-home, and data gathered from other sources that can inform on health status, such as mobile devices. The other term you'll hear us use is real-world evidence, or RWE. Real-world evidence is the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from analysis of the data. So data is kind of the raw information we're getting from places like the medical records, where evidence is the conclusions that we're drawing from that data based on clinical analysis. Real-world evidence can be generated by different study designs or analyses, including but not limited to randomized trials, including large sample trials, pragmatic trials, and observational studies. A couple of years ago, one of MDIC's board members made an analogy that I have continued to use every time I've talked about real-world evidence. So if Mark Carlson from Abbott is on the line today, he gets credit for this one. In a discussion about real-world evidence and what we can learn from it, he likened it to the difference between how you might study an animal in the zoo and the things you would learn about an animal by studying it at the zoo, and what you would learn about that same animal by studying it in the wild. The data we get from clinical trials is very valuable to help us understand the safety and efficacy of a technology. But it's a controlled setting. It's data that's being collected in a controlled way, often from patients that are come to us in a controlled setting. But using real-world evidence and taking a look at real-world data and analyzing it in real-world evidence gives us the opportunity to understand how our medical device products operate in the real world with real patients. So let's talk a little bit about real-world data and evidence in a real-life hospital setting. So I mentioned to you that I'm now at Providence St. Joseph Health. Providence St. Joseph Health is the third largest nonprofit healthcare system in the US. Providence is comprised of 52 hospitals with facilities from as far north as Anchorage, Alaska, to as far south as Southern California, and as far east as Western Montana and West Texas. Some of our hospitals are the largest in their respective states by bed count. This is true in Alaska, Washington, and Oregon. We are the largest provider of patient care in the region by volume in the Seattle, Washington, Puget Sound area, the Portland, Oregon metro area, and the Southern California, Los Angeles, Orange County regions. Providence also has a payer health plan and a risk-bearing ACO business currently covering just over 2 million lives. So as you can see, there's a lot of data here. I joined Providence to join a new department within our system called Health Insights. Health Insights at Providence St. Joseph Health is a real-world evidence and data and research team that leverages the scale and breadth of the Providence St. Joseph Health system. Our de-identified clinical data sets and real-world platforms for care unlock value and empower our vision of health for a better world. So we have 3 different service pillars within Health Insights. The first is a traditional translational medicine service line. This facilitates translational medicine research using our genomics and molecular profiling capabilities. The second pillar is our real-world evidence and HEOR service, where we harness large-scale electronic medical records and registry data sets to facilitate efficient and effective health economics and outcomes research, as well as patient journey mapping. And then finally, our clinical analytics service optimizes clinical trials planning, decision-making, site and investigator initiation, and helps connect patients to potential clinical trials via a data-driven approach. So when we talk about real-world data in this hospital setting, or in the case of Providence, a multiple hospital setting, where does this data exactly come from? Well, I have a couple of illustrative slides that I want to talk through about showing kind of what the data looks like for in a system such as Providence. So this example here is drawing on our cancer data set. This slide details the kinds of rich clinical data that are available in the Health Insights databases. So we have data just at the start from a total of about 1.4 million cancer patients. Current data includes detailed information that can help us understand patterns of care, where our patients interact with us across the healthcare system, and what challenges that they encounter at different access points. So we can focus on treatments and outcomes, including analysis of specific lines of therapy for defined cancer types, and analysis of adverse events, complications, and healthcare resources, and healthcare resource utilization. What is unique about this data source is that Providence has data from across the continuum of care. So what this means is that we can also identify and analyze inpatient and emergency room data that you may not necessarily typically associate with cancer care patient journey, but oftentimes these data points are relevant to the understanding the cancer care journey. Drawing from another example, this in cardiovascular, we have access to highly high quality curated clinical and outcomes data. And obviously some of these registries are going to look familiar to a lot of the folks that are on the line today. But what's unique about this for Providence in particular is that a number of our cardiovascular registries, we have been able to implement these, they're managed centrally at Providence. So we have a central management system through our Center for Cardiovascular Analytics, Research, and Data Science, which is based in our Portland, Oregon facility. And what this does is allows us as a system to really also collect this registry data and to really have a greater understanding and ability to analyze it, how it behaves across our system. Another thing we're able to do across our system is our integrated patient reported outcomes platform that's integrated with our Epic system. These are just some examples of some of the PROs that we routinely collect across the system. And again, because we have different hospitals in different geographic regions and different sizes of hospitals, this gives us an interesting opportunity to look at outcomes as patients report them in a variety of different ways and across the system. So as we put this all together, as in the cancer domain, we have, in our cardiovascular domain, we have a unique ability in Providence to integrate and cross-link our electronic medical records data, our patient-reported outcomes, and the data we're gleaning from the system-wide registries to have a highly structured, normalized data and long-term outcomes in many cardiovascular procedures and condition areas, and also, and as we illustrated before, also in cancer. So this unique ability to link registry and electronic medical record data opens up a lot of opportunities for really rich research into how different medical therapeutics are behaving in the real world with our patients. But I'll come back to the question I asked before, and that is, seriously, where is this data coming from? And I put together some great slides with really cool graphics to be able to show how all these different access points that where our patients encounter our system and what it looks like and how we can link them together and how we can do really cool analytical activities with this. But the answer is that this data comes from our patients. Providence St. Joseph Health is not an academic system. We are a community hospital system that was founded by a group of nuns that came over the Oregon Trail to the Oregon territories long before either Washington or Oregon was a state. And they wanted to care for people. We want to care for the people that live in our hometowns. And so we view our responsibility and how we steward our patient data is not just because of like, oh, look at the really cool things we can do with it, but it's how can we steward this data to better serve the patients that come into our doors every day. And so we're working with partners to be able to do that better. We're learning a lot as we go, but ultimately that's the driving force behind the work that we do in cultivating those real world data assets. And with that, I will turn it over to Carrie to talk about patient-generated data.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thank you for the really detailed overview of the data that's available in a comprehensive clinical system. What we're going to do now is kind of shift to another kind of real-world data, and this is patient-generated health data. And these data are just as important and are meant to complement the clinical data that Stephanie was talking about. Next slide. So Evidation Health, where I am now located, was born out of the idea that the things we do in everyday life can provide meaningful insights into our health behaviors, and can be used to create better health outcomes. And it's really the simple things we do every day, all the time, that we collect at Evidation Health and use to promote better health outcomes for populations. So what does this mean? So when we think about the clinical data that Stephanie was just talking about, we think of these as sort of visible data points. These are clinical visits, they're episodic, and while a system like Providence has billions of records, we're still only getting a simple snapshot of a patient's experience every time they visit the clinic or have a lab taken or undergo a treatment. But what we're interested in as well at Evidation Health is the invisible data, the stuff that happens in between these episodic clinical visits. Can we fill in the gaps between those visits to create a holistic picture of a person's general health and determine whether their activity level is either indicative of their health status or predictive of health outcomes? So why is this important? When we think about the claims data and the clinical data that we see in our kind of traditional concept of real world data, like what we see with Providence Health, two patients may look exactly the same. They may have the same number of visits. They may have the same lab values. They may have the same somewhat clinical history of disease from where they started to where they are now. But what if one of them has a much higher quality of life than the other? How can we tell that if we don't have data that's generated from the person themselves? And so patient-generated health data is intended to fill in those gaps so that we can actually look at patients who may, on the surface in their clinical record, look very much the same, but in fact have very different quality of life and therefore possibly very different health outcomes, even though their disease progression looks the same. So what we're doing at Evidation is we believe that we can take the individual, we believe that the individual themselves is can be the source of all of the data necessary to completely manage their health. And that is using that passive, continuous, remote data that we generate all the time, every day, to give a more holistic picture of a person's health status and future health outcomes. And why is this important? Well, when we match that with data like what Stephanie has talked about, we start to get an incredibly rich picture of each individual person's health journey and their potential health outcomes. And all of these data, as we're going to get to later on, are important for those of you in the device industry for how you develop your devices, how you monitor them, how you evaluate their impact on patient health, and ultimately how you create your strategic plan for getting them out to patients. So again, how would we do this? Well, all of us have a smartphone. Most of us have wearables, either a Fitbit or a Garmin or something. There's a plethora of them out there. Even just carrying your phone around every day tells you how many steps you've taken. It tells you what your screen time is, all of these different things. And so using these wearable and smart devices that we carry around every day, Evidation is capturing that data with individual consent, which I will get to in a moment, to fill in those gaps. And there is a remarkably rich story to be told just by looking at individual behavior and health in real time in the real world. We can understand issues of health disparity and health behavior and health outcomes that we really can't always get out of clinical real world data. So essentially what we're trying to do is capture what was previously unmeasurable, right? We have technology now that allows us to capture that invisible data. And I really like this diagram because we kind of have this, speckled person on the left here we don't quite have the whole picture. And so if you think about that as sort of what we're getting from the clinic, it's that episodic, we kind of know what's going on, but what's really happening? When you add in that person-generated health data from wearable data, and you add in surveys on your cell phone, mobile surveys and PROs, tasks that you can have people do on their telephones, at-home kits, we have telemedicine, and of course during the pandemic, all new frontiers of remote patient monitoring and data collection have been aggressively taken up by the clinical community and by others, showing just how possible it is for us to get an enormous amount of data from people in their everyday real lives. The key, though, that you can see in this diagram is that all of these data are individually permissioned. We're not monitoring people's phones or Fitbits or anything without their express consent. And at Evidation Health, that's something that we have really mastered, and that is getting individual permission to gather these data so that we can help generate better health outcomes. At this point, we have over 3.5 million participants who are contributing their data to this, this type of research. So this is just, I really like this picture. This is what we call the behaviorgram. So it essentially is a representation of an individual's behavior based on their activity data. So as you can see, we have direct assessments like functional ability and weight. We also have behavioral inference, so digital utilization, how often they engage. And then we can start to make clinical inferences about exacerbation events or when they've had treatment or progression in their disease. So you can see from the behaviogram, I particularly like the sleep one because I'm a big fan of naps. You can see that, you know, this person had some interrupted sleep. They woke up really early, but then they took a nap because they opened up, or because they woke up so early. We can see where they've opened up an app to check for the weather, and in middle of the day, or middle of the morning, they walked and talked on the phone. So all of these things maybe don't seem very interesting in and of themselves, but when you add them to the clinical real-world data and long-term activity data of this person, and if we know what their clinical diagnosis is, we can actually get a really rich picture of what it's like for them living with their condition. So essentially what we're trying to do, or what we're suggesting should be done, is that this person-generated data, this person-generated health data, be combined with data like what Stephanie was talking about, that clinical data source, and other data to provide a holistic picture of patient health. These are all real-world data, and they're all important for understanding how patients live with their conditions, how they interact with the health system, how they are impacted by treatment and medical devices, other therapeutics in the real world, and what their outcomes look like, and what it looks like for them on a daily basis, not just at clinical episodic events. And by doing this, we can support new discoveries. You, industry, can support new interventions that could help where you may not have realized there was a need. And so we're really excited about the potential for real-world data like patient-generated health data and the clinical data that Stephanie spoke of to help fuel these discoveries and become part of your strategic plan. So I'm going to talk about one more piece of what we would consider real-world data, and that's patient preference data. And some of you have heard me talk about this before. Stephanie and I have worked on this patient preference for a very long time, and we're still banging the drum on patient preference data. So what is patient preference? So there is FDA guidance, came out in about 2016, and that guidance defines patient preference as qualitative or quantitative assessments of the relative desirability or acceptability to patients of specified alternatives or choices among outcomes or other attributes that differ among alternative health interventions. So that's a really long way of saying a lot of different things. So what patient preference is, in other words, is patients' willingness to tolerate risk, given the benefits of a new treatment. So if I have a treatment that has a potentially higher risk profile, but patients are willing to tolerate that risk in order to achieve the real benefits, patient preference can measure that. We can use preference to determine priorities for treatment characteristics. We can rank treatment outcomes, examine willingness to pay, and in some cases determine the lifetime that patients are willing to trade off in order to actually receive treatment to have immediate benefit. So all of these are different ways of talking about patient preference. So how do we assess patient preference? We do this with qualitative research. We've used semi-structured interviews. You can use focus groups. Many of you have probably heard of the quantitative research methods mentioned here, discrete choice experiments, things called best-worst scaling, and latent class analysis, which can be really powerful for understanding heterogeneity of patient preference. So when different classes of patients, based on their characteristics, actually feel differently about their relative preference for a treatment. All of these methods, along with many others, were compiled in by MDIC in what we call affectionately the compendium back in 2017, I think, or 2016, Stephanie. I'm starting to forget these days, but and the compendium essentially lays out all of the different methods that you can use to assess patient preference, and it uses the FDA's obesity study as an example for each method. So FDA did an obesity preference study, and what they do in the compendium is for each of the methods, they say, okay, if we had used this method for the obesity study, here is how you would interpret the results. And so it's a really helpful guide. So a little bit more about methods. There are, like I said, many study methods available, but it's really important that the methods used and the study is being conducted is fit for purpose. So FDA has talked about this a lot with regard to preference studies, and that is ensuring that the study you're doing is actually going to help with your regulatory strategy or help with your regulatory submission. Along those lines, preference research must be rigorous. It must be clinically meaningful and somehow tied to the clinical outcomes of your patient population. It needs to be representative. So again, we have heterogeneity of preference when we look at populations. So we need preference study populations that are representative of the different perspectives that patients might have about these treatments. And of course, it needs to be analytically sound. There needs to be good rationale for the methods that are chosen. Study methods are going to depend on many factors, some of which are listed here. It's going to depend on your objectives. It's going to depend on your regulatory agency and your review team. And I know FDA has said many times to go talk to them. We also concur with that. Go talk to them before you conduct a preference study to make sure it's going to be the right way to go. Patient availability, budget, timeline, all the typical things that go into the influence of a research study are particularly important for developing methods around patient preference. So patient preference, patient-generated health data, clinical real-world data, these are all real-world data points. Preference talks about benefit risk for patients, what risk patients are willing to tolerate to obtain the benefits of new treatment. Patient-generated health data gives us a glimpse into the lives of patients in their everyday. It fills in those invisible gaps between clinical visits. And then we have clinical real-world data, which gives us that really important clinical diagnostic data that's episodic in nature, but when organized and synthesized like it is in the data sets that Stephanie talked about, can provide a really rich source of information about patient outcomes from treatment. And so our message today is really about taking all of these sources of real-world data and using them to create a patient-focused regulatory strategy. We want to encourage industry to not just check the box, not just talk to a couple of patients, but to leverage all of these data that are available to influence your regulatory strategy and really the total product life cycle of your medical device. So I'm going to turn this back over to Stephanie to talk a little bit about guidance.
All right, thanks, Carrie. That was a really terrific overview of just the different ways that we have the ability to really glean understanding from our patients, both from those kind of hidden data points that you talked about with the patient-generated data, but also really talking to patients and understanding their preferences with regard to benefit and risk. As Carrie said, we're going to talk a little bit about what the FDA has to say about all of this in the form of guidances. And we're going to start by talking about the framework for real-world evidence programs. This was issued in 2018. And really what this guidance outlines is the FDA's willingness to consider the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices. And they'll do this when the agency concludes that the data, that is that real-world data used to generate the evidence, are of sufficient quality to inform or support a particular regulatory decision. So that threshold for sufficient quality will depend on kind of the specific regulatory use of the data. So, as we like to say oftentimes with FDA guidance, the answer usually is it depends. But in this case, an example, a specific registry may be leveraged for post-market surveillance, but that may not be considered adequate to support a pre-market determination of reasonable assurances of safety and effectiveness or substantial equivalence. So, the type of real-world data you use and the real-world data strategy is, again, something that's best discussed with your FDA review team, both as you develop that strategy and as you seek to implement it during the process of developing your regulatory submission. Real-world data may potentially be used as some or all of the evidence necessary for understanding medical device performance at different points in the total product life cycle. So what does that data look like, or what does FDA expect to see in that data? FDA does not endorse one type of real-world data over another. And really, the medical device companies and sponsors should select appropriate data sources based on their suitability to address specific regulatory questions. Now, two things FDA will consider when considering their expectations for that data are relevance and reliability. When it comes to relevance, since real-world data sources are usually developed for non-regulatory purposes, like a medical record, or which is designed to document the care that a patient receives in a setting, is not designed to be used for a regulatory submission. FDA will assess whether these individual data elements contained within existing data source are sufficient to be used for regulatory purposes. The data should be accurate, as complete as possible, and have an appropriate ability an appropriate scope to address the question at hand. So some relevant factors to consider are the applicability to the question at hand. That is, the data contains sufficient detail to capture the use of the device, any exposures, and the outcomes of interest in the appropriate population. Is the data amenable to statistical and clinical analysis? That is, that the data elements available for analysis are capable of addressing the specified question when valid and appropriate statistical methods are applied. And then finally, is it interpretable using sound clinical or scientific judgment? That is, whether the use of the device in that real-world population is representative as captured within the data source, and whether it's generalizable to the relevant population being evaluated, and whether the real-world data contains elements to capture specific device identification information, and whether that real-world data also adequately captures patient medical history and pre-existing conditions. When it comes to reliability, we're thinking about how that data is accrued and how we can assure the quality of the data. So with regards to data accrual, the real-world data should have an operational manual or some sort of documentation that specifies what exactly you're collecting. What are the fields that you're collecting on a day-to-day basis? The methods for data aggregation and documentation, and the relevant time windows for when it's appropriate to capture this data and how soon after a visit. When it comes to quality control, data quality control is essential for providing confidence in the reliability both of the real-world data and the real-world evidence that we derive from that data. Published recommendations on data quality from particularly registries can be helpful. However, certain sources, such as administrative and healthcare claims databases or even electronic medical records, may not have established data quality control processes and may not be capable of implementing those registry standards. But some important data quality factors to consider include adherence to source verification procedures, the completeness of the data, data consistency across sites over time, evaluation of ongoing training programs for data collection, evaluation of site and data monitoring practices, and the use of data quality audit programs. Carrie and I have both said this already, and I'll say it one more time just for good measure. When talking about these kind of regulatory strategies, the best advice we can give is to talk to the FDA about your plans and your strategies early and often. And so, Carrie, with that, I will turn it over to you to talk about preference guidance.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, I'll echo the early and often message when it comes to using real world data. So FDA did provide guidance for the use of preference information, and that was back drafted in 2015 and finalized in 2016. And a lot has happened since that guidance came out. So the guidance itself is pretty helpful, but ultimately it's a framework for you to think about patient preference for your regulatory strategy, and really an invitation from FDA to go talk to them. And we highly recommend that because there's some really good folks over there who can help you. And the sooner you talk to them about your real world data and patient preference strategy, the more aligned you can be with the agency expectations and ensure that the efforts you put into gathering these patient-focused data points are really worthwhile. Since the publication of the guidance, CDRH has actually trained their review teams on how to interpret patient preference information. So, very often in the past, obviously, we've used primarily clinical data. So patient preference data, real world data, patient-generated health data, these are all observational data, and it's very different. And so the review teams have received training on these. CDRH also published preference-sensitive areas. These are priority areas that the agency is interested in seeing research be conducted on patient preference in these areas. And so if you're a medical device company working in a particular therapeutic area, it would be a great idea to check out these preference-sensitive areas. They're published on FDA's website to find out if the review teams are actually really eager to see these kind of patient-generated data, and not just preference data, right? So real-world data, patient-generated health data as well. We've seen a lot of cross-functional effort at the agency to generate additional multi-center guidance. They've done lots of presentations and webcasts, and a lot of messaging for industry. We know a lot of staff are integrated between CBER and CDRH, as well as CDER. And so there really is, we believe, an effort at the agency to help provide industry a solid framework for utilizing these patient-generated data in their regulatory strategy and submissions. And then there's peer-reviewed publications. So just recently, one that came out from FDA, just sort of reiterating the desire to see these patient data, what the requirements are, and what FDA's expectations are around these data. So a little bit about benefit risks. So we have the patient preference guidance, but I think it's really important to recognize that the desire for by FDA to see patient input of any kind is reiterated in several guidance documents that come from both CDRH and CBER. And these are primarily around benefit risk. FDA wants to know what patients think about the risk-benefit balance for any particular given therapeutic. And so you will see that in these three guidance documents, and there are even other documents, guidance documents from FDA from all of the review branches that in some way say, if patients say something, we want to hear about it. And so that's sort of our message from Stephanie and I today, is that FDA wants to hear about these data, and we'd like you to take a look at all these potential sources of data to inform your regulatory strategy, particularly if you have a device that has a unique benefit risk profile where patients' desires to achieve that benefit, to improve their daily life, to improve their clinical outcomes, outweigh the potentially higher risk profile of the therapeutic. So just a couple of examples of how patient preference in particular shows up in these benefit risk guidance. In considerations of uncertainty, which is something that FDA takes into account for approval and clearance, they're interested in hearing what the patient perspective is on appropriate uncertainty about the benefit and risks of the device. So they want to hear from patients. There are many ways that you can identify how patients feel about any uncertainty there might be. In decision making, patient input can be useful throughout the total product life cycle, and that's something Stephanie and I have been cheering on for as long as we've been working together, and that is, it's not just your regulatory submission. We want to be using these data throughout the total product life cycle, so that patient input is just inherent in that process. It is patient by design, if you will. And then enforcement actions. So, in the case of a recall or a field action, FDA will actually consider the impact on patients if we have that information that could occur as a result of an enforcement action. And so having reliable patient data can be useful for all of these purposes as well as many others. So just a quick note on the use of preference data. In fact, we have only seen 2 regulatory decisions where preference data has been explicitly referenced. According to a recent publication from FDA, there are 19 preference studies that are either submitted or in the pipeline, which is encouraging, but I think it's really important that we recognize that as an industry, we're not harnessing these data nearly enough, at least not in the regulatory clearance or approval process. And if we're using them for other things, we're not being loud enough about it. And so, obviously we don't want to share proprietary information, but it's really important that as an industry, we recognize the value of patient input, whether it be in the form of real-world data, patient-generated health data, or patient preference data to the life cycle and approval and clearance of our medical products. There is still, I think, some uncertainty among industry about the value of preference data and honestly real-world data for regulatory decisions. And, I am of the mind that it is of great value. I know a lot of other people feel that way. It's hard to put it into dollars and cents, which we know is a priority for a lot of C-suite folks. But at the end of the day, we're all here for patients, and getting their input just needs to be part of that process. We're still looking for best practices, and I think this is an area where, as an industry, as those of us working in policy, those of us like Stephanie and I who publish and just kind of work in this area thoughtfully, need to continue the effort. Organizations like MDIC and others can help with that as well, just generating best practices to help guide industry along even more in the use of these patient data points. So putting this all together, I'm going to turn this back over to Stephanie, and she's going to wrap this up today. I know we've thrown a lot of information at you today, a lot of data. And so Stephanie's going to kind of tie this all together for us.
Terrific. Thanks, Carrie. So what does this all mean? First, focusing on the couple of different audiences that we know are on this call today. I think the first point we need to make is that medtech needs real-world evidence. And as Carrie just pointed out, we know there's more opportunities for the industry to do more in this space, both in the use of real-world evidence in their regulatory submissions, and also in particular in the use of patient preference information and patient-generated data. We know that companies are trying it, they're seeing what they can do, but there's an opportunity to do more. Real-world evidence really needs to be considered a critical part of a comprehensive regulatory strategy. And to reiterate something Carrie had said, this is not just a one-and-done strategy, but rather committing to investing in things like real-world evidence, patient-generated health data, and patient preference information throughout the medical device product lifecycle. If you're asking for patient perspectives right before you go to market, you may kind of be too late at that point. So there's really an opportunity to learn what we can through patients directly in our interactions with patients, and also what we can glean from real-world data throughout the product life cycle. And as with all regulatory data that we're using to submit as part of our submissions to the FDA to show safety and efficacy of our products, there really does need to be a focus on quality, reliability, and clinical relevance. And finally, you aren't doing this all on your own. There's tremendous support and leadership from the FDA on this. They've published guidance on this. They've identified that this is a priority for them. And there's other resources to direct your real-world evidence efforts as well. And we also know another great partner for you in these efforts can and hopefully should be the patient community, that patients are interested in and invested in this. And your patients can be your greatest advocates because they want to see you develop new therapies as well that meet needs that will benefit the patient population. So what does this mean for patients? The patient experience has value and can make a meaningful contribution to advancing medical product development. This patient-generated health data that Carrie talked about can really help fill in the gaps where there of traditional clinical real-world data evidence. Patient preference information can provide critical insights for benefit-risk considerations in medical product development. And finally, when we say patient insights are relevant and necessary, the reason for that is because patients are ultimately the experts about the lived experience with their disease. They understand what it is to have this thing with them every day of their lives, and they know what will make a difference to improve their lives and their living with that particular condition. So they have this expertise, they have this knowledge, they're willing to share it, and we as a devices industry would be wise to listen to it. The National Health Council, which was a key partner of MDIC and a terrific organization, they sought in 2018 to really understand the patient perspectives on the use of this real world data and real world evidence. How do patients feel about their data being used? Data from their health records, data from their digital devices. How do they feel about that data potentially being used to advance research? And I think the key impression I take away from this list of 10 key points is that there is more work to do on educating the patient community about how this data can be used. But once those patient communities are aware of it, they're often enthusiastic about it. But I think as with all clinical research, where we engage with patients, we need to be aware of patient autonomy and patient authority on the use of their data and the use of their information. So that this needs to be something that's a partnership and an ongoing discussion, and not something where we just start taking data because we have it. I think the process that Evidation goes through, as far as that they have this database of millions of patients and every one of them is consented, really shows that it is possible if we think about these things in innovative ways and really work to both learn from our patients, but also educate our patients about how their data can make a meaningful contribution to advancing clinical research. And finally, I just want to say, and I feel like I've said this before at a lot of different MDIC gatherings in a lot of different ways, and I feel it's just as important today as it has been in the past, is that this advancing the use of patient preference information and really engaging with patients and how we design our medical technologies is not just a feel-good strategy. This is really valuable key evidence in our shared effort to make products that make a difference in the lives of patients. In the time that I worked at MDIC and worked with the medical devices industry, there's a lot of really smart people around the table. And we have a lot of terrific engineers and scientists and people that have a long list of degrees. But you know what? Our patients have a different kind of PhD. Our patients have a personal history of the disease, and we would be wise to learn from that. And so with that, hopefully we have time for some questions. This is our contact information if you're interested in contacting either of us to learn more about what we're doing, catch up, whatever. If you come through Seattle, we're both in Seattle now, so
Yep.
it's real nice out here in the summertime. Come on. And then finally, we have some key resources and information, and I would encourage you to contact the Science of Patient Input Committee at MDIC as well if you're interested in engaging on a lot of these activities.
Thank you for attending MDIC's annual public forum. We hope you will join us for next week's session, where NEST CC Data Network Director Robert Zusterziel will be joined by representatives from FDA, Northwest eHealth Limited, Evidation Health, and RAND to discuss perspectives on real-world evidence assessing its use, impact, and role in the United States and European Union. Visit apf.mdic.org for more information and to catch up on previous sessions.